Welcome back to the Legal Studies guy, and thanks for sticking with us as we are up to video 3.1.11. Our quote today, Nelson Mandela, obviously very famous, the former president of South Africa, and prior to becoming president, spent a considerable number of years locked in prison due to his political activism throughout the apartheid era in South Africa, where white people ruled and black people were treated effectively as slaves. And Nelson Mandela's quote is, "I never lose, I either win or learn." I think a really, really important one for all walks of life is the idea that, even if things don't quite go the way you want, if you don't win, then you take some learning from it. You are better next time for the experience. It's similar to a quote from Yoda in one of the Star Wars films, I think, which is the greatest teacher failure is. The idea that failing and not winning is very important to our own improvement and to being better next time. So a good quote for you guys, because things aren't always going to go to plan during year 12, and it's about what you learn from those experiences. As I mentioned in that first slide, we are at 3.1.11, and thanks for sticking with us through this long first area of study. Nearly there, 3 to go after this. Our last video, we looked at the specific purposes of sanctions and what a judge needs to consider as per the Sentencing Act. And in this video, we're going to look at 3 specific sanctions: fines, community corrections orders, and imprisonment. And we're going to look at their specific purposes. This will allow us to answer the essential question of what is a fine, which I think is probably self-explanatory to most of us. What is a community corrections order, which is the one that might be a little bit trickier and we'll spend a little bit of extra time on. And then what is imprisonment? And can they meet the purposes of those 5 purposes we looked at in the last video. So, to review that, as per the Sentencing Act of 1991, every time a judge hands down a sentence and gives an offender a sanction, it must meet one of these 5 aims or a combination of these 5 aims. And they are to punish, to deter, to rehabilitate, to denounce or to denunciate, and to protect or to protect. Naturally, it's pretty rough or pretty difficult to meet all of these. Some would say 9 impossible. For example, if you lock someone in prison for the rest of their life, that's clearly punishing them. But if they're never going to get out, it's no chance of not offering any opportunity for rehabilitation, for example. So it's definitely these 5 purposes can compete with each other a little bit. And we're going to look at 3 specific types of sanctions today. And we're going to look at both how perhaps they meet these and where there might be shortfalls in that and what they don't meet. So, first up is we'll go to the third one listed in the study design, which is imprisonment, and this one is pretty straightforward. What we need to be careful is the fact that they could ask you to explain or define what imprisonment is on an exam. It's highly unlikely, but it's a possibility. What we want to avoid is explaining imprisonment by saying it's when someone is sent to prison, because that's basically using the same word to describe the concept. So some language we can use for imprisonment is where an offender is detained in jail, so not using the word prison, for a period of time called a sentence. That's our statement, they're detained in jail. And then as we expand on that and explain it further, they lose their liberty and other freedoms, so they can't move around, they can't go to the shops, they can't work. And effectively, because we do not have capital punishment or the death penalty in Australia, this is the most serious sanction available. It's known as the sanction of last resort. So in the Australian legal system, and in the Victorian legal system, which we're specifically looking at, imprisonment is the big kahuna. If you get sent to jail, you've done something pretty bad. And obviously then there's different scales where people can be sent to jail for a couple of months right up to for the rest of their life. I won't spend too much time here. Imprisonment is something that should be pretty self-explanatory and you should understand. But if you do want more information, just generally go to the Sentencing Council website to get some more information about everything to do with sentencing, but you can specifically find information on imprisonment. Our second specific sanction that is mentioned in the study design is another one that is quite self-explanatory, and this is fines. So fines are just monetary penalties. I'm sure you've been fined in perhaps your local cricket club or footy club for doing something silly. Potentially fined by your parents for swearing at home, like a swear jar type system. In the legal system, fines are monetary penalties that are paid to what's known as the court fund, and this helps to both run the court, the day-to-day running of the court, so pay wages and that sort of thing, but also the court fund is then often directed into different charities, supporting victims of crime, that sort of thing. Basically what will happen is, if you are fined by a court, so if a judge gives you a fine as a sanction, they will tell you how many penalty units that fine is worth. And as of currently, and this changes or will change on the 30th of June, as it changes every financial year, one penalty unit is worth $158.57. So, for example, if a judge gives you a fine of 2 penalty units, your fine is going to be 2 times $158.57, which for those who can do a bit of big shot quick maths is $317.14. So going up from there, fines can comfortably get up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars or more, particularly if it's a criminal matter maybe involving an organisation. And depending on the level of offence, dictates the level that the fine can be. So there are certain offences that might be capped at 10 penalty units, which means the maximum fine there obviously can only be the maximum fine there can only be $1,585.70. Right up to fines, as I said, that could easily get into the millions of dollars and might be 1,000 or more penalty units. Again, more information on fines can be found at justice.vic.gov.au. I think there's some information through the Sentencing Council as well. And this link basically sums up what happens if you're fined, what happens if you can't pay it, how you can go on payment plans and that sort of thing, which is an option that the court fund offers. You'll just see here noted really quickly, the most serious offences cannot be punished by a fine. So like murder, serious drug offences, it's like the Act says, so the law says, this cannot be punished with a fine. So the idea being that a fine is not a serious enough sanction there, and in those circumstances you'd be looking for this sanction of last resort. Finally, our third one, and the one that might need a little bit of extra work, is a community corrections order, or often abbreviated to a CCO. Now, community corrections orders sometimes come under a lot of stick in the community because they can be seen as being a little bit soft by some. Basically, as the word community shows us, a community corrections order is a community-based sanction, aka you are not in a state facility like a prison and detained for a period of time without your liberties and freedoms. You live in the community still. Okay? So you're able to remain living in the community, potentially living in your own house or living with members of your family or similar. And then there are conditions that are attached to you remaining in the community. And these might be things like unpaid community work, rehabilitation sessions. They can put restrictions of movement on you, so certain locations you aren't able to enter into or go to. They can put curfews on you, so you have to be home at this hour. They might electronically monitor you, potentially, if you're on a community corrections order. And the idea being that if you breach any of these conditions, you will be sent to prison. Okay? So let's just say, for example, and it would be maybe similar to, I'm not sure if you've listened to and I would recommend it if you haven't. I linked through the Facebook page The Law Report, which is a podcast that had an episode on South Australia's gambling court, which dealt with sentencing people who'd been found guilty of offences that stemmed from their gambling addiction. So like theft from business, etc., to fund their habit. We don't have that in Victoria. It operates very similar to Victoria's drug court. So let's build a scenario here where you've got, let's call him Anthony. And Anthony has developed a gambling addiction. Anthony is, let's say, $20,000 in debt to a local bookmaker who lives near him, and he doesn't really know what to do. So he's $20,000 in debt. He's a little bit worried about what might happen to him. So he starts taking money out of the till at work. Not much, $1,000 here, $1,500 there, to try and start paying back this $20,000 loan. Anthony's caught doing this. He's referred to the police by his boss, and he's charged with theft. And he goes to court and he pleads guilty. He says, "Yep, I did it. I'm not going to defend myself." In that situation, the judge is probably going to look at it and be like, "Okay, here's Anthony, clearly done the wrong thing to try and feed his gambling habit. Do I want to send this person to jail? Are they a threat to the community? Are they a threat to individuals in the community? Probably not. So this is the sort of person who might be a candidate for a community-based sanction, because they could live in the community without fear that they might injure someone or hurt someone. So the judge might give Anthony a community corrections order and say, "Hey, I'm going to sanction you to a community corrections order, so you'll remain living in the community. You'll be perhaps able to, I assume you probably get fired. He probably got fired from his last job, but pick up a job somewhere." And then Anthony would have conditions placed on him. One of those conditions might be that he needs to complete 120 hours of unpaid community work, with perhaps Gamblers Anonymous, or the Gamblers Helpline, where he would actually go around and talk to people about addiction. A second condition might be that he is not able to enter any gambling venue, any licensed gambling venue. So he's not allowed to go to any hotels that have the TAB or Keno. He's not allowed to go to the casino or anything like that. And so they might be the two conditions that are placed on him. And the judge might say, "Anthony, you're going to be on this community corrections order for 2 years." Anthony could walk away from that, and he could never do anything wrong again in his life, do his unpaid community work, keep working, live for 2 years, the community corrections order finishes, and he goes on with the rest of his life. He'll obviously have a criminal record, but it'll hopefully almost be like nothing happened to him, and he'll be able to be rehabilitated. If in that 2 years, though, Anthony is caught in a licensed venue or gambling venue, or he fails to complete his unpaid community work, what can happen is it would then trigger his community corrections order, and he would be placed in prison to finish the end of his sentence. So it's the idea being that, hey, you can live in the community, but you've got to do certain things to have that right, and if you don't do them, we'll put you into prison anyway. Community corrections orders can last up to 20 years, although they're generally over the course of 5 years or less, often 1 or 2 years for situations similar to that one I just made up there with Anthony.
as well as the optional conditions that could be attached. So like I just mentioned, like restrictions of movement or curfews. Every community corrections order has some standard conditions, which are you can't commit any other offence. So you've got to be of good behaviour. You have to get permission if you want to leave Victoria so that you don't run away from your community corrections order. And you will need to regularly report into a community corrections centre just basically to say that you're still around and that you haven't done the wrong thing. Again, Sentencing Council, more information on community corrections orders, but remembering community-based sanction with conditions attached. So basically, yep, we're going to let you live out in society normally, even though you've done the wrong thing, but you've got to do some certain things for us. The key skill here is discussing the ability of sanctions to achieve their purposes. Now, we know that by their purposes, we're talking about denouncing, rehabilitation, deterrence, protection, and punishment. So of those three sanctions that we just looked at, do they meet these aims? And this is what we need to be able to discuss. And as we know, to discuss is to exchange opinions. So what that means, deciphering this, is that for each of those sanctions, for fines, community corrections orders, and imprisonment, we need to be able to exchange the opinions of which purposes they meet and which purposes they do not meet. So looking at both sides. So, for example, for imprisonment really clearly meets the aim of protection and it meets the aim of punishment. It meets the aim or the purpose of protection because you are physically removed from society, so you cannot harm any other members of society, apart from ones that are in prison with you, obviously, and hopefully not. It also meets the aim of punishment because you have your liberty and freedom taken away from you. You're removed from your friends and your family. You can't continue everyday life like normal, and that is a punishment. Most people like the idea that they can move around freely and do what they want to do most of the time. However, and notice the scaffolding and use of a linking term there to change our argument. However, what purposes does imprisonment not achieve? Well, in 2016-17, and this was in an ABC report that I can definitely drop you a link to through Facebook, 43.6% of prisoners were recidivists. Now, recidivism, which is a special vocab term, means have been in prison before, i.e. nearly 50% of our prison population had been in prison previously. So this is their second or more visit to prison for an offence. This shows us that prison doesn't actually deter people from coming back to prison. You don't go to prison and think, oh yeah, I never want to go back here again, because 44% of people end up back there again. Therefore, prison doesn't meet deterrence and prison doesn't meet rehabilitation, because again, 44% of our current prison population has been there before, meaning that prison didn't rehabilitate them. It didn't change their behaviour. So there you can exchange opinions on which purposes imprisonment meets. You can do that quite easily. We can do the same with fines. Maybe fines there. Fines are a great deterrent, and you'll often hear people communicate, and maybe you've heard your parents do this, or maybe some of your mates that might now be 18 and are driving around. Basically, people don't speed because they don't want to get a fine a lot of the time. Not because they actually truly believe in road safety or looking after other road users. They generally don't speed because they don't want a fine. You see your mate get a speeding fine and you think, you know what, I don't want to lose $280. I'm not going to speed as well.
Finable offences, as it says here, are not usually crimes of passion. They're not like really emotive crimes. They're usually things like driving offences or failing to vote in a council election, or using Eastlink without an account, which means they're more likely to be based on a conscious choice. You choose to use that toll road, or you choose not to vote, or you choose to pull out in front of traffic without a blinker, like some people do. And therefore, it's assumed you have more control over your behaviour. So the idea being that if you think that you might get fined for it and you have more control over that behaviour, you will be deterred from exhibiting that behaviour. It also obviously meets the aim of punishment, because we just like money and you don't want to lose your money. So pretty straightforward. However, fines absolutely offer no protection whatsoever. This is because you can just pay your money and move on. You're not removed from society. You're not prevented from redoing that harmful behaviour, apart from maybe a little bit of deterrence. Therefore, society is not protected. You make an argument here about not so much about purposes, but about equality as well. Someone who's rich can pretty easily pay a fine and not feel any deterrence whatsoever, whereas someone who's poor might have more of an issue with being able to pay that. So therefore, there's a little link to the principles of justice there that we can visit later on. Our final ones are community correction orders. And these are really, really good at some of those things that maybe imprisonment doesn't meet. And that is deterrence and rehabilitation. So particularly rehabilitation, most people on a community corrections order will have to undergo some form of rehabilitation program, which tries to address whatever the reason for their offending is. My scenario with Anthony before, he's the sort of person who, as well as part of his community corrections order, might be forced to undergo a gambling or a gambler's help type course, therefore aiming to address his gambling problem, which was the cause of his offence. The hope being that if he succeeds in that program, Anthony will never steal again. It also meets punishment because there are certain conditions that you have to meet, including giving back to society in some way, which means society gets their retribution, if that's unpaid work or something similar. And it's deterrence, because you're actually out in the public on a community corrections order. It could be argued that you are more visible to the public. They're more likely to see any hardship that you suffer as a result, such as difficulty getting a job, or the unpaid community work you have to do, or the conditions like you can't go certain places, and therefore they're less likely to commit the same crime. But again, like fines, just here, you are not removed from society, so you're still living in the community. So even though you're supervised, it can be seen as soft on crime, and it can be seen as the fact that community members aren't protected from individuals who've done the wrong thing. This is the sort of question that you would therefore get, and this is what it would look like. So discuss, as we know, having two sides or exchanging opinions, the ability of imprisonment to meet the purposes of sanctions. So we'd be looking at just that table we've just done. Does and doesn't. And your sample answer might look something like this, and this would be a little bit underdone for 5 marks, I'd say, but really strong with that evidence. First of all, identify your evidence. Imprisonment is able to achieve the purpose of protection. So a really clear statement. Yep, imprisonment does achieve protection. Explain that. So now we go into our explain. This is because an individual who has committed a serious offence will be removed from society, ensuring they cannot harm anyone else. So pretty straightforward. Now, in a perfect world, we'd expand that a little bit more, but it's a pretty straightforward concept. So then we link into our next bit of evidence. However, imprisonment does not achieve the aim of rehabilitation nor specific deterrence. So again, identify that evidence. Explain it. Recent studies have shown that 46% of Victoria's prison population, sorry, it should be 44, had been in prison less than 2 years before their new sentence began.
So they've got out and less than 2 years later they're back in. So that's that explained, how it doesn't meet specific deterrence or rehabilitation. Thus, prison does not rehabilitate offenders nor deter them from committing future offences. So again, linking back to the prompt. So whilst there's no real expansion here, and I'd probably want to include an extra piece of evidence to get the full 5 marks, you can just see how you'd structure a question that asks you to discuss the ability of imprisonment or community corrections orders or fines to meet the purposes of sanctions. You'd say, hey, identify they meet this, explain how that works. However, identify they don't meet this and explain how that works, and then link back to the prompt. In terms of the principles of justice, I mentioned with fines and equality how, fines are a bigger deal for some people. Again, like I've said previously, try and fill this in if you can. But for sanctions, we're going to actually look at this at the conclusion of the next video as a whole. So looking at the different factors a judge considers, and then we're going to fill out this table with with looking at the purposes of sanctions, looking at specific sanctions, and looking at those factors. So we'll hold off on that one for now. In terms of examples or case studies or scenarios to look at, that article I've just been talking about recidivism rates can be found here. That includes the stat about 44% of prisoners having been in jail less than 2 years prior to their current prison sentence. And this one's really, really cool, and I'd really recommend having a go at this. So you head over to the Sentencing Council, and one of the little tabs up the top is called You Be the Judge. And what it does is it basically allows you to go through the process that a judge goes through in sentencing someone, and you get to decide the sentence you would give to an offender. You have to take into account all the different factors that you consider. You have to try and work out what purpose you're trying to achieve. And you basically get to choose if you'd fine someone, if you'd send them to prison, or if you'd give them a community corrections order. So in terms of really immersing yourself and having a crack at applying those purposes of sanctions, definitely go to You Be the Judge by the Sentencing Advisory Council. This one was a little bit longer than I intended, but I really wanted to make sure I gave a bit of depth on community corrections orders. As we know, fines and imprisonment are a little bit more straightforward, but community corrections orders need a little bit of extra work. And hopefully the example of Anthony was helpful in thinking about some of the conditions that might be applied to someone. Therefore, you should, fingers crossed, be able to answer this essential question. What is a fine, a community corrections order, and imprisonment? And can they meet the purposes of sanctions? And the answer to that is obviously somewhat. Write up an answer to that essential question. If you need more support, remember, textbook. Obviously, I recommend the Legal Maze. Rewatch this video if you need to, but more importantly, talk to your teacher, who'll be able to give you the extra information that you might need to succeed with this. As always, really, really appreciate any feedback. So you can post that in the comments section below. And yeah, head over to our Facebook page as well. Facebook.com/The Legal Studies Guy, where you can review the program, like it, get regular updates and things like that, so that you're always up to speed right through to the end of the year. Yeah, move on to 3.1.12 if you're ready to go, or otherwise I'll see you in a few days for that one.